Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Heller, a junior at the University of Chicago and an intern at the Keller Science Action Center of the Field Museum. The Action Center is the conservation wing of the Field Museum, where around 30 scientists and educators work to translate the museum's collections and expertise into on-the-ground action for conservation and quality of life. Today, I want to share some first results from a research project I'm working on with two Action Center staff, Nigel Pitman and Mark Johnston. We're going to focus on the Chicago wilderness region of Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan. And I want to start by acknowledging that all of those places are within the traditional homelands of many indigenous nations. I want to recognize the original peoples who knew these lands so well and cared for them for so long, as well as the diverse indigenous peoples who reside in the Chicago wilderness region today. Wildlife in the Chicago region a few hundred years ago was so abundant that it's almost impossible for us to imagine today. Even the first European explorers were amazed by what they saw. Here's a report Louis Joliet made about 350 years ago, after drifting down the Illinois River, amazed at how many animals he saw. We can't see what Joliet saw, but today we've got a window on Chicago's biodiversity that is equally astonishing. And that would have been just as impossible for him or the original peoples to imagine. It's iNaturalist, a community science platform where tens of thousands of people are now sharing their observations of plants and animals of the Chicago region practically every minute of every day. So back in 1673, Joliet couldn't go a quarter of an hour without seeing a lot of game. Well, here's what you'd drift past if you spent a quarter of an hour on the iNaturalist Chicago Wilderness Region webpage during a typical afternoon in the summer of 2020. In just 15 minutes, we get this. And they keep going, dozens and dozens of observations. I can't even fit them all onto the same slide. Just parenthetically in this talk, I'm kind of assuming that everyone knows what iNaturalist is. If you don't, the one sentence summary is that it's a website where anyone, anywhere in the world can post a natural history observation or identify someone else's natural history observation, or just browse through the 57 million and counting observations logged by people so far. Here's the web address. The other thing I've been assuming so far is that everyone out there knows what the Chicago Wilderness Region is. It's an area covering 7.7 million acres around the Chicago metropolitan region, a sort of crescent-shaped area along the shore of Lake Michigan in Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan. More importantly, it's home of the Chicago Wilderness, an alliance of more than 200 different agencies, nonprofits, schools, businesses, and other organizations that do conservation work across the region. So iNaturalist is amazing on the summer day we're looking at here, and it's amazing on every other day of the year as well, even in the kind of weather we've been having this month. Here's an amazing observation from a few days ago of an immature bald eagle eating a seagull on the frozen Calumet River. In 2020, more than 12,000 people logged observations on iNaturalist in the Chicago Wilderness region. They logged an average of one observation every daylight minute, for a total of more than 250,000 observations. That's almost double the number of observations logged in 2019. And when we look at the number of observations made each year over the last 10 years, what we see is exponential growth. From a couple thousand observations in 2011 and 2012 to more than 250,000 observations in 2020. I don't mean exponential in the casual sense of the word either. The number of new observations made each year fits an exponential curve pretty closely. Over the last 10 years, the cumulative number of observations for the Chicago Wilderness region has been doubling every 14 months or so. Right now, we're around 600,000. Another 14 months from now, we'll be around 1.2 million. 14 more months, 2.4 million, and so on. We see the same kind of growth in other community science platforms like eBird. And this skyrocketing growth makes it clear that community science biodiversity datasets are soon going to be the biggest biodiversity datasets for the Chicago Wilderness region, if they aren't already. That's something really new, and it's pretty disconcerting, especially if you're accustomed to getting your biodiversity data from the Field Museum or the Illinois Natural History Survey or the Department of Natural Resources or another similar place. And conservationists in particular need to take a close look at these platforms and figure out what they mean for our work. To help with that, we've set up a page on iNaturalist that collects all Chicago wilderness observations in the same place. It's set up to include every observation ever made by anyone inside the Chicago wilderness region, past or future. An observation made 10 years from now, here. An observation made 10 minutes ago, also here. An observation made 10 days or 10 years ago, it'll all show up here. Yes, you also get store-bought bananas and giraffes at the Lincoln Park Zoo, but you can filter those out. So this is a good place to browse through Chicago wilderness observations, see summary statistics, and so on. But in this talk, I want to go a little deeper. I want to give you a quick x-ray of the data set. We know the platform has strengths and weaknesses. I mean, this is a huge data set that's being built on the fly by thousands of strangers who are just walking around, kind of following their bliss. So in our x-ray, we want to get a closer look at questions like, what kind of biases does that generate? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the platform? And how are those biases, strengths, and weaknesses changing as iNaturalist continues to grow? To answer these questions, we're going to focus on the 10-year span of observations made from 2011 to 2020, about 600,000 of them. Thanks to iNaturalist's open data standards, we know a great deal about the where, when, who, and what of those observations. Almost all of them are geo-referenced, most of them very precisely. For about 77% of them, we have a species name. The others are identified to genus, family, or some higher level taxon. And again, it's important to note that we're not just asking these questions out of curiosity. We're looking for answers that might be helpful or useful for people doing conservation work across the Chicago wilderness region. Now, there's no question that iNaturalist is already a valuable tool for conservationists in the Chicago wilderness region. If you're managing a small park or reserve, the platform is a great way to engage with people who visit the area, neighbors who live nearby, and students who are getting to know Chicagoland plants and animals for the first time. It's a great way to communicate what's special about your area. It also seems like it could potentially help keep track of which plants and animals are there. Here's an example of several hundred iNaturalist observations made in a tiny remnant of native prairie in Glenview, Illinois, the James Woodsworth Prairie Reserve. Green points are plants, red points are invertebrates, and blue points are vertebrates. But what about at the larger scale? How can iNaturalist be useful for conservationists who are working across the whole Chicago wilderness region? Let's have a look. And I'm going to try to link on what we learned to the larger conservation goals of the Chicago Wilderness Alliance. So first, let's talk about the growth of the platform. This is important because iNaturalist is a moving target. Earlier on, I showed you how the number of observations each year has been growing exponentially. Well, why? Is it because the people who use iNaturalist are making more observations every year? Or is it because more people are joining iNaturalist each year? And it's pretty clear the latter is true. The number of observers each year is growing exponentially at the same rate as the number of observations. And that explains almost all of the growth in observations. That insight is helpful as we think about how this growth might plateau in coming years. Let's look at some projections. This is that same graph I showed you 2 slides ago, with the number of observations made each year growing exponentially. It looks different from the earlier graph because this one has a log scale on the y-axis. Because of that, on this graph, the exponential function fit to those data isn't a curve, but that gray dotted line. Projected over the next 10 years, the dotted line says that the exponential growth will continue indefinitely, and that in 2030, we'll be making 100 million observations in the Chicago wilderness region in a single year. That's more than 3 observations per second. And we know that that projection is almost certainly wrong. What we know that the dotted line doesn't is that there are some hard limits on exponential growth. We know that the growth in number of observations is being driven by the growth in the number of observers. And because there's a finite number of human beings in the Chicago wilderness region, a projection like this just isn't realistic. So what does a more realistic projection look like? We've been thinking about 3 scenarios. In this first scenario, we assume that in a given year, the highest community participation we'll ever see for iNaturalist is 1%. In other words, we get to the point where 1 out of every 100 people in the Chicago wilderness region is actively logging natural history observations on iNaturalist. To put this in perspective, in 2020, we saw a participation rate of about 0.1%. Because we know from the last 10 years of data that every user makes roughly 20 observations on average, we can convert our estimated maximum number of observers into an estimated maximum number of new observations each year. In this scenario, number of observations would level off at about 1.3 million per year, which is about 5 times the number of observations we saw in 2020. That would be pretty amazing. Here's a second, slightly more optimistic scenario. In the second scenario, we assume 5% community participation. We assume that 1 out of every 20 people in the Chicago wilderness region is actively using iNaturalist. This scenario has us leveling off at an estimated 6.5 million observations per year. That's 25 times what we saw in 2020. And in the third scenario, we assume 10% community participation. 1 out of every 10 people is actively using iNaturalist, which has us leveling off at 13 million new observations per year. That's 50 times more observations than we saw in 2020. Now, obviously, we don't know which of these scenarios is closest to what we'll see over the next 10 years, but there are 2 important lessons here. First, no matter which of these 3 scenarios turns out to be correct, they're all really good news. All of them deliver us a massive community-driven biodiversity monitoring system for the Chicago wilderness region. The second lesson is that we shouldn't sit back and wait to see which of these scenarios will triumph. Remember, because growth in observations is driven by growth in participation, Chicagoland institutions have a lot of power to decide which of these 3 scenarios we end up with, and thus how good our public biodiversity monitoring system ends up being. Just one example, about 15% of all people in Chicago are students in the Chicago public school system. If CPS as an institution adopted iNaturalist as a teaching asset, that would have a huge impact on which track these numbers take. One of the goals of the Chicago Wilderness Alliance going forward is more nature-based programming. Making iNaturalist a pillar of that programming with iNaturalist-based events like 50 Days of Chicago Nature, City Nature Challenge, and BioBlisses looks like a win-win strategy. As more people engage with nature, the conservation community gets an even larger and more powerful data set, and the Chicago Wilderness Alliance can monitor progress towards its goals of increased engagement with iNaturalist user data. We need more institutions to adopt them as their own, and we need more of these events in more neighborhoods. That's especially important because iNaturalist records show a very strong spatial bias. In this map, which is divided up by census tracts, the places with the most observations are dark green, and the places with the fewest are light gray. As you can see, it's incredibly patchy, even when we zoom in to Chicago. The best observed neighborhoods have more than 1,500 observations per square mile. The least observed have fewer than 15. There are more observations in neighborhoods with big parks or are on the lakefront, and more observations towards the north side. Clearly, some of these disparities are linked with neighborhood wealth, race, and access to green areas. So it's really important that nature-based programming done by Chicago wilderness conservation groups include specific efforts to break down some of the barriers in a way that allows these neighborhoods to participate. It's also important for conservation groups to know that the large majority of iNaturalist observations in the region, more than half of them, are being made inside parks and reserves and other protected lands. So we want more iNaturalist users, and we especially want more users in underserved neighborhoods. But let's take a look at the users we have now, those 24,000 people who made observations between 2011 and 2020. When we ask how many observations each one of those users made, what we see is extremely uneven. Most people make very few observations, and a handful of people make a ton of observations. On this not very active side of the distribution, about a third of those 24,000 people made just 1 observation in 10 years. Over on the other side of the distribution, the 100 most active users accounted for nearly half of all observations, and around 60% of research-grade observations. We call these super users. And obviously, the data set has a huge bias towards what these super users are up to, what they're interested in, where they're going, when they're going there, and so on. People like Jeff Screntiny, who's made more than 17,000 observations and logged more than 3,000 species so far, And who took the picture of the bald eagle I showed earlier? Looking at these super users, there are some valuable lessons for conservation groups. First, it suggests that when we work to get people involved in iNaturalist events like City Nature Challenge, we should expect the vast majority to make very few observations, which means that in addition to engaging the general public in these events, we also need to figure out how to find and empower that very small proportion of people in the general public who have some likelihood of becoming new super users. It's also worth remembering that there are barriers to becoming a super user. You need a good cell phone and data plan, free time, and access to green areas. How can we lower these barriers? This is especially important in geographic areas of the Chicago wilderness region that have very few observations right now. More on that later. Now let's talk about the quality of these observations as assigned by iNaturalist. It's a little complicated, but there are three basic categories: from low quality to high, casual, needs ID, and research grade. Casual observations are ones that can never qualify as research grade observations because they don't have a date, geographic coordinates, a photo or sound, or because they're of a cultivated or captive organism, like a store-bought banana, tulip in your garden, or lion in the zoo. Needs ID are observations that can someday be research grade because they do have a photo, date, and location and aren't cultivated or captive. They're just waiting for enough users to give them a species name. And once they have a species name, they become research grade, the highest quality observations. The good news is that the dataset is dominated by research grade observations, which account for 61% of all observations and are themselves growing exponentially, as you can see in this graph. The other good news is that casual records, the poorest quality ones, are really a small part of the dataset. The bad-ish news is that needs ID observations are a big part of the dataset and are growing faster than research grade. I say bad-ish instead of bad because these can eventually become research grade records. But how fast is that happening? Surprisingly, it's pretty fast. Almost a quarter of the observations that were classified as needs ID when we first started looking at the dataset in May 2020 have become research grade by January 2021. That gives us an average rate of 17.5 new research grade observations that were previously needs ID observations every day due to identifications on the platform in the second half of 2020. Unfortunately, that's not fast enough to keep needs ID observations from piling up, which is one reason iNaturalist has started to dabble in automated identifications via its new app called Seek. We can't say too much about this because data from Seek aren't included in the dataset we're looking at, but it's a potential solution to the problem of so many needs ID observations. Let's talk about the species that are being recorded by iNaturalist users in the Chicago wilderness region. When you only look at research grade records, around 7,000 species have been recorded so far, which is an astonishingly high number. Again, it doesn't include stuff like bananas and the giraffes at the Lincoln Park Zoo, but it does include non-native, introduced, and invasive species that aren't captive or cultivated. These are the number of species recorded for each group in the last 10 years. To make the figure easier to see, I've left out protozoans, mollusks, arachnids, and so on. So dominated by insects, plants, fungi, and birds, which is pretty close to the way the number of observations breaks down as well. It's also worth mentioning that these proportions are now pretty stable when you look at an individual year. It's not like some years amphibians come out of nowhere and dominate the numbers. Every year it's plants, insects, and birds. Back to species. Now, obviously there are 1,000,001 questions we could throw at this data set regarding the species that are being observed. So we're going to look at a couple of basic angles. How complete an inventory of these groups iNaturalist is providing at this point, and how many of these species have accumulated enough observations on iNaturalist for us to see some robust patterns about where they're being observed, how the frequency of observation changes over time, and so on. Let's start with inventory completeness. We've been comparing species lists on iNaturalist with checklists for species for each group. Again, we're only looking at research grade records. Our results are preliminary, but it looks like last year, iNaturalist users recorded somewhere between 80 and 90% of the region's mammals, reptile, fish, bird, amphibian, and plant species. What we think this means is that as the number of observations continues to increase, iNaturalist users should be generating nearly complete inventories of these taxonomic groups every year going forward. Again, these are preliminary results, and there are plenty of questions to look into. Questions like, how do these numbers change when you remove Jeff Scrutony's observations? Are we talking about all species or all species that are identifiable from a photograph? But it looks like going forward, iNaturalist users are going to be generating an impressively complete inventory of plant and vertebrate species in the Chicago Wilderness region. Among other things, that means when a never before seen species is added in, say, 2027, it could potentially help alert conservationists to the arrival of a new invasive species in the region. But just because people are recording most of the species doesn't mean they're generating a lot of information about those species. Let's take a look at how many species have accumulated a significant number of observations. It turns out that a huge proportion of the 7,000 species recorded to date have only been logged once, or are only observed once in a given year. So how many species do we have good information on? We'll get to that answer in a sec. But since we're talking about well-observed species, let's take a quick look at the 10 most observed ones. These are the 10 species with the highest number of observations from 2011 to 2020. Monarchs lead the way with more than 3,000 observations, and their host plant is a close second with more than 2,200. The rest of the species are all animals. They're all vertebrates, and they're almost all birds. They're mostly big or showy, and when you look at the top 10 list of species for the entire United States on iNaturalist, these same species dominate there as well. So we've got a lot of information on these species, for better or worse. How many other species are well observed? Here's one answer. If we consider a well-observed species to be one that has at least 100 observations on iNaturalist over the last 10 years, then we've currently got around 800 well-observed species. This is a graph showing the cumulative number of well-observed species over the last 5 years. Before that, there weren't any. About 200 species are being added to the well-observed list every year, which with the exponential growth of the data set is going to mean that a significant proportion of all species are soon going to be well-observed species. What about the 12 species identified by the Chicago Wilderness Alliance as deserving special conservation attention, many of which are rare or hard to observe? How many of these qualify as well-observed species on iNaturalist? The answer for now is 4 of them. Here's the number of research-grade observations for each species over the last 10 years. So we can see that for some of these species, iNaturalist is going to be an increasingly powerful tool for conservation. Monarchs are the best example. There's enough data to get better answers on when the first monarchs are arriving each spring, what sorts of habitats they're using, and eventually, once we learn how to correct for a number of biases in the data, it should be possible to link the number of monarchs observed each year, which is what the graph is showing, to the size of the population passing through the region. But it looks like iNaturalist may never be much help for some other priority species. Mottled sculpin, ellipse, and aquatic organisms in general are not recorded very frequently on iNaturalist. And a species like little brown bat is hard to photograph, hard to identify on the fly, and unlikely to ever be recorded by a large number of users. For the rest of the species, the ones that are somewhere in between well-observed and poorly observed, time will tell. Let me wrap up and summarize what I've shown you in this talk. I hope you haven't missed it because it's kind of been hiding in all the details. What I've shown you is the arrival in the Chicago Wilderness region of a huge community-based biodiversity monitoring network. If that sounds like an exaggeration, check back in 14 months, when the network is twice as big, thousands more people are contributing to it, and hundreds more species have been recorded. Yes, I've shown you that there are some really serious biases in this data set. Biases in who is doing the observing, where they're observing, what they're observing, how frequently they're observing it, which species they're paying attention to, and how correctly they're identifying them. And there are many more. But we shouldn't let those biases obscure the real story. The real story is that we're seeing the birth of a massive community-based biodiversity monitoring network for the Chicago Wilderness region. It's a small D democratic network run by thousands of people, some of whom have PhDs in entomology, and some of whom are third graders, truck drivers, poets. Together, they're giving us a very complete inventory every year of the plants and animals that share this remarkable place on Earth with us. In this talk, I haven't even scratched the surface of what these data can tell us about the conservation trajectory of natural areas in the Chicago wilderness region, or the conservation status of threatened species here, or how plants and animals are responding to climate change, or 100 other questions of interest to conservationists. For the time being, maybe the important thing is to celebrate the arrival of this incredibly powerful new set of eyes and work hard to make sure they're seeing the full diversity of people and places in the region. We may never see what the first explorers and original peoples saw in this region, but with a tool like iNaturalist, we have the potential to see even more than they did. We're still explorers in a canoe, drifting down the Illinois River, and not a minute goes by that we don't see something wonderful. Clearly, there are a million other questions we could ask about iNaturalist data in our region. Some of those are being answered at this conference. So if you enjoyed this talk, I want to encourage you to attend Matt Mulligan and Nina Hill's, which will provide some deeper insight into some of the spatial patterns we touched on briefly. And if you have specific questions that you think would be especially insightful for conservationists in the region, please let us know. We put together a list of research questions about iNaturalist that are relevant to conservation that we'd like to see someone out there answer. We're up to about 100 questions at this point, and we'd be happy to add yours to the list. Some of the most interesting questions on that list are about the conservation impact of iNaturalist use on the people who use it. Does it increase people's knowledge of biodiversity? Does it change people's relationship with nature? Does it give people a greater appreciation for their neighborhood or a stronger sense of place? Does it inspire people to care for natural areas in new and different ways than they would have otherwise? And if it's doing any of those things, how is it doing them? And how can we build on them in order to meet and exceed the region's conservation goals? So what can you do? Join iNaturalist. If you're already on, find someone who isn't and get them involved. Have a look at the Chicago Wilderness Project, which you can find by typing Chicago Wilderness into the iNaturalist search bar. And consider making your own project on iNaturalist focused on your favorite park, reserve, or neighborhood. Just no more bananas, please. Of course, this work would not be possible without these institutions or important contributors. I want to especially thank the iNaturalist community for their continued hard work and dedication to documenting all the nature that surrounds us. And finally, we would like to thank you for your time and attention. We are excited to see your contributions and how you can help iNaturalist grow. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you.